you rightly stand by the fact that Israel should be criticized like any other country who are engaged in mass violations against humans, against humanitarian law, against human rights, precisely. So I was just actually watching this show by James O'Brien. He's a UK anchor, and he had a guest on his show, and that guest too happened to be from Jewish faith. And that guest was, I mean, what she was trying to say is that she was criticizing the mass protests that have been happening across the UK for ceasefire and for Palestinian rights. And in that interview, James highlights the fact that it's not just people from the Muslim faith or Palestinians who are part of those protests, but a large uh, there's a great share, not the majority share, but there's still a significant share of people who belong to the Jewish faith who are actually saying the same thing as you just did, not in my name. And the response was that those are very extreme right-winged, they are anti-Israel, and they are pushing uh, a different narrative that they're basically vouching for the terrorists. So that was the response given to the Jews who were like you were standing for a ceasefire, for a humanitarian pause in the current crisis that is happening. If one is not a Jew, and you would have come across that very frequently as well, that one of the biggest pressure points is that whenever one is propagating for the rights of Palestinians or criticizing Israel, it's con conflated with being anti-Semitic, and which leads to a lot of advocates being wary of how and what should they say, how should they frame their words. So if you are to speak with that person who was on that guest, how would you address her, or people with that mentality? How, because having an ally, someone who comes from a Jewish faith, but is for some reason has been made more cognizant and aware, how would you direct it to them uh, to develop that same sense of understanding? Or what are the pain points that you would like them to highlight on to make a more rational, logical deduction?
Yeah, I think particularly for, people making that argument on, large news stations, and corporate media particularly, they're doing it from a really intentional way. Whether or not they believe it or not, they're doing it to essentially defend their policies that they are defending, and it's a very common tactic to demonize protesters for protesting policies where you have an interest in. So you often see, for example, groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which often are going after and attacking Jewish people and communities of color for protesting Israel. And they use this completely conflated notion and completely harmful narrative that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. It's been something that's been developed and shaped over the years to silence dissent and to silence any criticism of the state, which happens in any of the most repressive tactics, right? I mean, looking in history, the South African apartheid state completely demonized people who were protesting across the world. I mean, the U.S. had Nelson Mandela on a terrorist list until the mid-90s, late 90s, calling him a terrorist for resisting the apartheid state, and then calling anyone who criticized apartheid or sympathized with the people resisting that system or supported people resisting that system, the rights of people who were being completely living under an apartheid state, calling them terrorist sympathizers and demonizing them. And so it's a very common tactic, and so it's hard to take serious at all these type of allegations, given that they are just such a broken trope, but they are very extremely harmful, and they very much lead to more violence against people who are Jewish, and they lead to more violence against they lead to more Islamophobia and anti-Arab violence and sentiments, because they're the one associating the state of Israel with Jewishness, which is a false conflation. And in doing that, they are the ones fomenting anti-Semitism. So it is very anti-Semitic to say that criticizing Israel, criticizing a very human rights abusing government of its abuses is anti-Semitic. It's a very harmful narrative, but it's very strategic. It's used in order to discredit, in order to take out the wind behind large movements, and we can just see it happen again and again. And so it's very similar to the Black Lives Matter protest movement, how people, particularly early on, when this was happening really early on in 2014, 2015, when the Black Lives Matter movement was really starting, and the way that anyone associated with these type of protests were being criticized and called anti-police, and this is where the all lives matter type of narrative develops, and it's very similar here to the way that protesters are demonized. And it's incredibly tragic to see that people are silenced in this way. I mean, it's also important to put it in the context of people who are Israelis who are speaking out. I mean, look at the organization Breaking the Silence. It's literally called Breaking the Silence because they are silenced in a way where speaking out is so dangerous, because you're ostracized, you're demonized, you bear the brunt of the repression from the Israeli state, and so I think it's really important to put it in a context, but also to understand when these people are levying these criticisms. I mean, for example, it was a Fox News anchor who asked the U.S. State Department official the other day, I believe yesterday, they asked them about anti-Israel protests, completely trying to just stoke them and to rile them up. And then the response from the State Department spokesperson was absolutely absurd, and they started getting into how the work that the administration is doing against anti-Semitism. So they were the ones that made the association from anti-Israel protests to anti-Semitism, which is completely bogus. It's a very harmful, tragic narrative that's pushed by Fox News alike, as well as MSNBC alike. You see how there's no air between these major corporate outlets that are either on the right or liberal, or whatever they consider themselves. They are using the same really harmful propaganda.
And it's also important to highlight like how you mentioned the word and how they've been framing it as anti-Israel. Sometimes it's not even anti-Israel. It's like pro-Palestine, it's pro-liberation, it's pro-human rights. But then that is where the framing, the narrative peddling comes in very handy. And these key words try to build the entire image and create these nuances, which are not that complicated to begin with. So anyhow, like my last question for you would be that, of course, you belong to the Jewish faith, but you also happen to be an American citizen. And the role that the US has been playing, especially this recent Joe Biden's administration, in which they're advocating for, and Joe Biden himself is requesting for $105 billion military aid package for Israel to help them for their self-defense engagements, is quite shocking. It's disheartening. There's so much more that could have been done, but it also kind of highlights how the structural roots themselves are completely, how to put it, ignorant, and refuse to acknowledge the atrocities that are committed against unarmed civilians. How and the Jewish Voice for Peace, actually one of their mandates is addressing this bill, and they've been very vocal about it, and so have you. So how do you feel about US's role, the way it's shaping its policy for Israel? And do you think that the pressure that is being applied by uh, organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and other Arab organizations that are pro-Palestine, would that kind of help them recalibrate that policy? Do you envision a positive impact coming out of it?
I think there is going to get a point where there is going to be a tipping point where the US, because of so much opposition, Washington is not going to be continuing to be able to essentially finance the occupation. I mean, the US has paid for around 20% of Israel's military budget over the years. They give around $4 billion in aid, which is largely military weaponry. It's US made bombs, often, and US made armament that's carrying out, the direct attacks on the people of Gaza. So the number one priority in terms of ending this conflict is preventing US funds, preventing any more US funds. And this large supplemental request that the White House is asking for, a lot of it is funds for Ukraine. It's some funds for Taiwan, it's funds for Israel, and it's also funds for border enforcement. And it really illustrates where Washington's policies are in terms of fueling war in a lot of ways. But the Israel funding, I think, is around 14 billion. And it's largely military weaponry, and it's largely going to weapons contractors who are literally making a killing off of this. When you just look at the stocks of Lockheed Martin and other stocks that are skyrocketing when war happens, and whenever the U.S. asks for billions and more for new type of weapons and weaponry. So that's a number one ask, and definitely invite people to go to Jewish Voices for Peace, which is an organization that I support. I'm not part of the structure, but I definitely just support in the organizing efforts, and urge people to go there and to go to other sites to look at avenues to notify your member of Congress, particularly if in the US, if you have a member of Congress, which if we live in DC, we don't, but other folks that are able to, and lobby and tell your member of Congress to not support this funding, more weapons to Israel, and to also call for a ceasefire, which is a really baseline ask, but there has only been actually a handful of members in the House of Representatives who called for ceasefire, very brave members of Congress. And as of today, there's one senator who has explicitly called for a ceasefire, Senator Durbin, who is a very powerful senator. So that should hopefully snowball. So more members are asking for that. Really, it's quite a no-brainer ask to just ask for ceasefire in order to facilitate peace.
Absolutely. I think